take this information to your practical method. You will find these little kids, and this will really help you make sense of what you need to do. All right? You're going to help me by
So I hear that yesterday's speaker was amazing, so I'm feeling a little nervous. I have big shoes to fill today, so just be kind. I'm hoping I don't screw up too badly. My topic is a big one, and that's why I had asked Barb when she initially asked me to do a 3-hour presentation and gave me 3 topics. And she said she wanted you to have kind of information about each of these topics and some strategies on how to deal with them. I said, you want me to do that in 3 hours because these are like the biggest topics. I am passionate, sorry. There's that there. Can you see? Okay. I am passionate about all 3 of these areas. These are things that I've had a fair amount of training in and experience with children who have it. I'm working with kids right now every day who have all of these issues. So I have lots of examples of kids, which is always kind of fun. And I wanted to bring videos of some of my kids, but I'm not organized enough to get the parent permission happening. So the videos that I have are actually from YouTube. And I'm realizing I forgot to line them up, so I will probably have to take a minute or 2 to get the videos called up. So I'm a speech and language pathologist in the schools, and traditionally I think most people see that as I work with kids who have lisps, who can't say their R's, who stutter, and yes, I work with those kids. I work with kids who can't say their sounds. I work with kids who have fluency problems. But the job is so much broader than that because it really deals with children who have any kind of communication issue. So communication is part of our daily interactions. It's big, and you think of all the things that can interfere with communication. And if there's a communication breakdown of some sort in a student, that's when I'm involved with them. Now, in my district, I actually also have a second job. 70% of my job is as a speech and language pathologist in 3 different schools, which is a very light caseload for speech pathologists. We're lucky in our district, we're very well staffed. So we only have a few schools each, whereas I know in Nanaimo, if full-time in Nanaimo is 7 or 8 schools. So we're really lucky. And it allows us to spend more face time with the kids and really consult better with the teachers. So a lot, especially with, you guys know the RTI, response to intervention stuff, right? With that model, a lot of our job is more and more towards consultation. We don't pull the kids out as much as we used to. We do a lot more consultation with the classroom teacher and with the rest of the team, the student support services teacher, the counselor, everybody who's at the school that supports these kids. We do a lot more consultation. So the primary part of my role these days is less about pulling kids out, although I do that. My days are full of pulling kids out. But it's less about that and more about making sure that the supports that are in the classroom are appropriate for the kids. That's 70% of my job. 30% of my job, because I have the extra training in autism and executive functioning and all these other things that I've picked up over the many, many years I've been doing this, I do we call it district learning services. It started as an autism team, a district autism team, where we would go into the schools and support the schools with the kids who had challenges. And there are 2 of us who are on this team, and last year we each did it 20%. This year she's doing it 10% of the time, and she is focusing her attention on social thinking courses in the high schools, which is really exciting, and she's really gifted in that area, so that's fabulous. So that means that 30% that I'm running around to the rest of the school district, which is a little district, right? Like there's only 4,000 kids in the district, so it's not that bad to run around the district and consult with the people on the challenges that kids are having. And it started with autism, but the strategies that we learn for autism are really strategies that work for any number of issues with kids. So I'm called in with kids who are just called behavior challenges. I'm called for kids who have FASD. I'm called for kids who have any kind of challenge the school doesn't know what to do with them. And it doesn't even have to be behavior. They can be a little mouse and sitting in the corner and producing nothing, and I can get called in for those kind of kids. So that's what 30% of my job is. So So like I say, so we do diagnosis of speech and language difficulties with kids, and in schools, in order to access our services, the teachers usually have to try some strategies in the class. In our district, this is how it works. They have to try some strategies in the class. If those strategies don't work, they bring the student to school-based team. Some action is decided on at school-based team, and that may be involvement of one of the professionals. It may be that more strategies are given to the teacher to try. There's different ways that can go. There's some cases where it's a real obvious referral to me, like if the kid is speaking in vowels and they're in grade 1, then speech pathology referral, that's a no-brainer. But there's some cases where it's a little fuzzy and we're not quite sure what could be the problem, so we're going to try different strategies. We might go and do an observation and try and figure out what's going on with the student. But that's actually a big chunk of my job, is that observation, consultation, giving strategies. I might go in and I've gone into classrooms and helped the teacher do a presentation to kids, maybe on one of the students who has some special needs, or I've gone in and talked about autism to kids in classrooms. I've gone in with teachers and worked with them to teach a strategy to the kids, maybe the 5-point scale or some visual strategies that are necessary for the kids. So it's a really changing and evolving role, and it's a very different role to when I started. But like I say, I still do work with kids directly, sometimes in groups and sometimes one-on-one. And what's really important for the kids who are on IEPs, it's always really, really important to have the speech pathologist as part of that process. Doesn't always happen, but it is always really important to do. Communication is 90% of the time a big chunk of their program plan, and it's critical that you have a speech pathologist there for that. So what I wanted to do, and I mean when I'm talking, I really like conversation. I have a lot of problems just being the only talker, so what I want to do, I want to list some student behaviors. These are behaviors that I've seen in kids, and they're kids I know and kids I understand. And I want to just have a discussion on what you guys think is going on with these different behaviors when you see them. So the first one. So this guy, he's given the instruction, he sits down to work, and he's told, you know, get to work, get to work, get to work. He doesn't, he just doesn't. He sits there for the entire class, and then he takes the work home. And his parents, it's like, it could be like 20 minutes worth of work. It can be a 3-hour job at home to get him to do it. The parents are exhausted through nagging and prompting him. So I would be interested, what were your thoughts? What would you guys do about that? What do you think? If you were this kid's teacher, how would you respond to this? Yeah?
I would try giving him more visual cues if he's not getting verbal prompting.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one.
Maybe he just has no clue what's going on in the work, so he doesn't have any knowledge of how to do it.
Yep. Yep.
Break it down.
Break it down.
Break it down in smaller chunks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good one. We're going to come back to these because after we've gone through everything, I want to tell you more about the kids and more about what we did for them and whether or not it worked. But those are all right exactly on target of the kinds of things we're going to do. This guy, he would yell. He would run from the room. He gets to the wall. He runs down the hall when he's blowing up, ripping stuff off the walls, kicking garbage cans. At recess, the other kids break the rules. He loses it. He loses a game. He loses it. He has destroyed computers. He has trashed rooms. When there's a problem, he tends to blame other kids, especially when he's in that state too. He'll say, well, they weren't following the rules, they were following the rules. And in the moment, he feels very justified in that it's not his fault. It's everybody else's fault for not doing what they should do. So that's not taking responsibility for his actions. What do you think about this guy? What would you do about him? Looks like a traditional behavior guy, right? Like we'd call him a behavior problem.
Well, just from yesterday, it kind of reminds me of one of the FASD courses we were talking about.
Yeah?
And he had lots of strategies in place for this child.
Yeah, you guys have the advantage of having had the FAS stuff yesterday.
Well, I think a lot of behaviors are, there's a root behind them, right? And that's, I think, what you need to get at. Like the first one, like, we need to figure out, well, what is he not understanding? What strategies can I give him? Same with this student, like,
Yes.
And getting more information, so that then you maybe implement some strategies and some, and guide that student. But maybe they need to be seen and heard in a
Yeah.
certain way, and you need to figure that out.
Absolutely, that is absolutely right. And that is hopefully the kind of information you'll get out of today is how to look at these kids, like get to the root. My favorite saying is behavior is communication. And that's exactly what I mean, get to the root of it. So now we have this little girl whose desk is jammed with random papers and pens, and she's 9. And the floor around it, she's surrounded by papers and broken pencils and garbage. Lovely little girl, not really acting out, but just a mess. What do you think of her?
She needs some adaptions on organization, like colored guillotines and things like that.
Yeah.
To try to, she sounds like she's overwhelmed, so she probably also needs smaller amounts.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how you guys are going to the smaller amounts of stuff because that's actually a huge strategy for a lot of these guys. And I know some of these things that I'm going to be talking about today are definitely connected. Like the FAS guys have a lot of these same issues. It's hard to tease some of this apart sometimes. The diagnosis usually isn't as important as the kind of how the neurology is affected. Regardless of diagnosis, the neurology is affected in some way, and it's understanding how that neurology is affected. So this is a little kindergarten guy, actually, who yells, he rips his paper when he can't get his paper exactly the way he wants it. What is going on here?
Could it be a little bit of OCD maybe? I think again, we would have to maybe have him have his own things or kind of get him prepared for the day.
Yeah, yeah. He's actually he's a really complex guy. It's really good that you went to that OCD place because I think that is part of who he is for sure. Perfectionism, right? I want it to look like this, and I can't get it looking exactly the way it is in my head, and so I'm going to get really frustrated and have it fit. Would drawing be a real calming activity for him? No, not so much. So this guy, another kindergarten guy, when the class ends circle time and moves to the tables, he roars into the kitchen center and starts hucking things. What's your guess at what's going on with him?
Well, he has trouble with transitions.
Absolutely. Absolutely he has trouble with transition. That's exactly what's going on with him. And it's interesting from your talk yesterday, this is a guy that we suspect is possible FAS. Now this guy, he works super hard, super hard. He's got an amazing work ethic. He gets right to work. He sits there, he listens to the instructions. He gets right to work. He's doing it wrong, or he's working on the wrong thing. When he's asked a question, he doesn't answer. He doesn't answer. Or he might answer a question that he heard 5 minutes ago. Any thoughts about this guy? Yep.
He has delayed processing time?
Absolutely. One of the longest processing times I've ever seen in this guy, actually. He's really a slow processor. In fact, this guy, I'm leaping ahead of it because I wanted to tell you this afterwards, but this guy, I assessed his language, and his processing time was so long. I mean, I know these kids, and I make allowances for these kids, and I'm forgiving of these kids. But he had his head turned away, and his body language was such that I was thinking, and in his facial expression, I was going, is he refusing? And I never think of those words. Those words don't come to my head because I don't believe in putting those negative words on kids. And I was thinking, is he refusing to answer this? So I sat there, and probably about 30 seconds went by, and he's still doing this. Finally, he turns to me and he answers the question, and he was right. And I thought, wow, I need to start keeping track of this time. And it was, some of the questions, the more abstract they were, the longer it took him to process it. But it could be 20 to 30 seconds before he responded. Really long processing time, especially for a kid that looks pretty typical. Like he's in class, he gets to work. And he's like, it's not like he's a real, I still use the word low functioning, but I believe they call him early learners now. He's not an early learner guy. He is doing academics like everybody else. And to have this long a processing time is really unusual in a student like that, but it's genuine, and he's a really nice kid. This guy, another kindergarten guy, playtime, he plays by himself. If you try and join him, and I tried to join him, and he would throw my things out of the play area. He turned around, turned his back he turns his back to the other kids, pushes other kids away. Doesn't join into other kids' play. He'll sometimes watch them. If he joins their play, he'll try and take it over. Any thoughts on this guy? What's going on there? Yeah.
I'm going to say he's falling into the autistic and using social skills.
Yeah. He's not diagnosed, but yeah, that is what he's looking like to us for sure. Yeah. Well, you guys are good. Now this little girl, I really wanted to bring my video, but actually I couldn't get a meeting happening with the parent. I would have loved to bring this video. She was so classic. She starts to talk. She says lots of incorrect words. She doesn't say what she intends. She gets frustrated with this. When she tries to name a picture, she says it incorrectly. Now I had her naming pictures in categories, and we went over the same categories all fall. And at the beginning of December, I pulled out the same category, and she's looking at them like, what is it? Can you tell me? She just couldn't get that. What would you call this?
I actually have a question rather than an
Yep,
answer.
for sure.
And it's about the line, she never says the message she intends. How do you know what she's doing?
Because she says, I don't mean that.
Okay.
She said, no, that's not it.
Okay.
Yeah. There's frustration in there. She also has a fabulous sense of humor, so she'll laugh at herself when it comes out wrong. She'll giggle and say, I didn't mean that. A great one girl. Very sweet. So language processing disorder. Now you guys are already, I think I've got my slides kind of out of order because I've got the disorder here before the what is language thing. But you guys are already kind of on this page of understanding that there's neurology behind things, kids might not be understanding things. These guys have problems attaching meaning to sounds, words, and sentences. It's really about that comprehension piece a lot of the time. Sometimes it can be both receptive and expressive, receptive being the input, the comprehension part, expressive being the output, the expression part. So problems formulating an expressive response. So that little girl, huge expressive issues, some comprehension issues, but her expressive issues are just really, really, they're like textbook expressive language problem. She's really involved expressively. So the cartoon is, that's not what I meant when I said let's put on all the stops. He's got all the stop signs. Literal interpretation of things is what you see with these guys. They have a lot of trouble with figurative, metaphorical language. Even as they get older, these kids hit that, whenever that poetry courses and they have to think metaphors and similes. I don't know the curriculum, I don't know what age they are when they hit that. They really struggle with that stuff. They just can't wrap their heads around it. The abstractness of it is really confusing to them. I wanted to talk a little bit about auditory processing because you will hear about auditory processing. The strategies that you use for language processing work for auditory processing for the most part too. Language processing is about the meaning of the language. It's about formulating responses. It's about your vocabulary, your sentence structure, your grammar. It's about having access and understanding all those components and parts to language. Auditory processing is is a lot more specific. And I've noticed when I have Googled auditory processing that they're mixing up language processing and auditory processing. In my world, they're two very separate things. And in the speech and language world, they are two very separate things. Auditory processing is more about specific sounds and interpreting sounds, the sounds of speech, when they have good hearing. So they get their hearing tested in a soundproof booth. They have ideal hearing. In an ideal environment, they have perfect hearing. When they go to listen in the classroom, they're not hearing the words correctly. They are not hearing in background noise. Now, I have to say, a couple of years ago, my loved ones were on me about my hearing, that I'm not hearing properly, and that as I age, that clearly my hearing is going out the window, because that is a normal aging thing that happens, right? So I went and got my hearing tested. I have perfect hearing. But what the audiologist said to me is that your auditory processing starts to diminish with age too, and I know that's what's happening to me. I cannot listen in background noise anymore. I often hear words incorrectly. I know that someone said a word that sounds like chair, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't chair in that context. Doesn't make any sense. So I know that I'm not hearing things correctly, and it's the sense of it that clues me into that I misheard it. Now we get kids, of course they can have language processing problems and auditory processing because all these things overlap. Nothing exists in isolation for the most part, right? But when you get these kids, you see them. I had one guy I was assessing, and he kept saying, "What? What? Oh, I thought you said this." And then once he got what I'd said, what I really said, he understood it just fine. It was really about his auditory processing. And I just looked at a little girl like this as well. She gives me that puzzled look because it doesn't make sense in what she thinks she heard, and what I said just didn't make sense to her. This is an area that is a little bit, people can't necessarily agree on what defines auditory processing necessarily. You will hear it called central auditory processing, you will hear it called auditory processing. And there is some argument about exactly what is involved in that. I have seen people include auditory memory under auditory processing. Personally, I see it as different. I've heard lots of people pull memory out of there because it involves different neurological processes and it's attached to kind of the memory part of the brain, and we all know there's a gazillion different types of memory. And the other one is auditory processing speed, which, we talked about the guy whose processing speed was very, very slow. Some people include that under auditory processing. I tend to, because the speed of processing impacts their accuracy of processing, but some people are really pure and say, no, it's the accuracy of how they are processing the sounds and the words that is impacted. You can see with auditory processing the impact that would have on learning to read, on even following directions in class. They're going to mishear stuff. It affects their phonemic awareness when they're trying to learn to put sounds together and hear sounds in words and sound them out themselves. They're not getting it. If they have auditory memory problems, it also affects their decoding because they're not going to be able to retain all the sounds in the sequence and put them together in order to know what the word is. So you can see that the processing piece, or the elements of that auditory input, is really important to academics too. They need to be able to hear it. And then of course language processing is really about the extracting the meaning. So for diagnosis, a speech and language pathologist diagnoses language processing disorders. Auditory processing disorders, we hear audiologists really want to own that, but they don't test for it. I think in the States they probably do, but since there's very few audiologists that actually test for it, the speech pathologists tend to own the auditory processing too here. But then the audiologists will get on a bandwagon about how it's theirs, and anyway, so that's our stuff, right? But I can tell you if a kid's got an auditory processing problem or not, as can any speech pathologist. So language, this is where I'm thinking I got my slides kind of backwards, but anyway. Language, that in my world, in a speech and language world, has nothing to do with reading and writing. Well, it has everything to do with reading and writing in one sense, in that it's the underlying construction for your reading and writing skills. Reading and writing is language written down. So that means that the language part is really critical to building their academic skills. Receptive language, comprehension, that is another word for comprehension. I don't include reading comprehension. Now, a child who's reading, say, at a grade 2 level, and comprehending their reading at a grade 2 level, doesn't mean that when you think about it, understanding language as a typical 7-year-old is very different than understanding what's written on a grade 2 reading page. Because that written material that a grade 2 child is reading is very simple in structure and content and vocabulary. It's not going to require a 7-year-old level of comprehension to understand that. So there is that gap that's really important to remember when you're talking about comprehension. Because I often get a grade 2 or 3 student referred to me and I'm told their reading comprehension is fine, so I really don't think it's about comprehension. And there's a big difference in understanding the sentences in a grade 2 or 3 level reading than there is with understanding the language that you're speaking to a 7 or 8-year-old with. So that's an important difference to remember. We don't measure their comprehension of language by their comprehension of reading. It's very different. When I'm assessing students for their language, with their language comprehension, I'm using pictures, I'm using following spoken directions. I am not using any reading and writing material. That is not part of my job. I really don't know a whole lot about it. You guys are the experts in that. I don't really know a whole lot about that. Expressive language, how they talk, how they form their ideas, how they form their sentences, how well they can pull the words out when they need to. The little girl who couldn't name the pictures, massive word retrieval problems, huge word retrieval problems. When she goes to explain something, she just can't pull the words out that she has. She has a bank of words in her head, and this is typical of kids with word retrieval problems. A bank of words exist in their head, but they can't necessarily access those words. What I find sometimes, very often with those guys, and I'm going to a workshop on word retrieval pretty soon, and I'm really interested in it because I have all these theories about retrieval, and I want to see if they're backed up. But what I find about, often with kids who have lots of word retrieval problems, their vocabulary is not very flexible. They don't have a lot of connections and links between the words. So they might have the word, say, dive, but they don't necessarily think of, they can't really separate the meaning of dive and jump into the water. They can't separate the meaning, they don't, not quite sure on the difference between dive and swim. So when you show them what they know, diving is associated with water, but they don't really have a general specific enough knowledge of it. So when they go to retrieve the word, they can't because their knowledge isn't specific enough to pull the right word out at the right time. It's kind of like when I'm talking about the brain. I know lots about it, but it's really vague.
Is word retrieval at all connected with auditory processing?
Auditory processing, you know, it could be in a sense, but remembering auditory processing is all about the sounds of language.
Do any of those, like, does that ever go together? Does it link when somebody has a problem with auditory processing and might have a problem with word retrieval?
Yeah, absolutely. Like all these things, in language, things don't really exist in isolation. That's an interesting question because when I'm trying to put that together, because I think with word retrieval, I'm always trying to search out why are they not retrieving those words. So sometimes I think it really comes down to just a memory issue. If I see a kid who really has pretty okay language, but their memory is really poor, and they've got word retrieval problems, the word retrieval is probably centered around memory. If they really are missing all these links between words and those interconnections, I think it's about that specific knowledge of vocabulary, and that's really what I see the most. Now, I'm just trying to think, if they're not processing the sounds correctly, then it could impact their ability to pull the words out because you do need to have some sort of phonemic sense of the word in order to pull it out. So I think that's a possibility for sure. Good question. But expressive language, of course, is broader than word retrieval because some kids just have problems putting a sentence together. Some kids have problems just having the vocabulary, having enough words. Their vocabulary is really limited. So it's a fairly complex process as expressive language. And all of this is neurological, so because it's neurology based, everybody's brain is different, and so everybody's language is going to look different. So the three main components to language that we look at, this is a little bit simplistic because we are a lot broader in our assessments than this, but basically vocabulary, we also call the semantics. I use semantics more because of, meaning of the whole sentence versus meaning of the word. But it's knowledge of words, comparing and contrasting words, the links between words, knowing what's important when you're describing something. I had this guy, he was just assessed in April, and I had a group going from his class on language, and I've been working with these kids all year on descriptive language and bringing words out. And they had the patterns down pat, and they were getting pretty good at describing. And he joins us late in the year without having any intervention before. And so he pulls up a lawnmower to describe. So his first description of that lawnmower is, it's got a rabbit. And the kids are looking at him completely blankly, and they start asking questions. And their first question is, well, what's the category? Because they're well trained and we've been working on that all year. What's the category? And he just looks dumbfounded. He said, well, it's got a rabbit on it. And it took us a long time, because his expressive language was so poor, to figure out that on his lawnmower at home, the rabbit, it had a little picture of a rabbit to mean fast and a turtle to mean slow. Like some lawnmowers do that, right? I think I had a lawnmower once that did that. But that's what he was talking about. I didn't even know what he was describing. I had no idea what picture he had pulled up and was trying to describe. It's got a rabbit on it. But that's what he came up with in his head. Is that the most significant thing to say about a lawnmower? Obviously not. The most significant thing to say about a lawnmower is it cuts your lawn, or it's a garden tool. But he brought this completely irrelevant thing up that doesn't apply to all lawnmowers, and is so small and unnoticeable that it wouldn't be a descriptive feature of the word. So knowing what's important to provide in a description, that also, what I find is there's a real connection, and that particular kid, he has a lot of problems with knowing what's important in general. So not only when he's describing things, but when he's trying to make inferences, what does he focus on? He doesn't know what the important clues are to focus on to make the inferences correctly. So knowing what's important is a very critical language skill. And is it important for academics? Absolutely it is. They need to know how to do that, to summarize, to take notes. They need to know what's important. I hate to think what this poor little guy's note-taking is going to be like as he gets older. It's not going to be good. So the grammar, when I was first trained back in the 80s, we had a lot of focus on grammar. I remember in my first practicums working on sentence structure a lot, and we had a very strong focus on grammar. We don't pay an awful lot of attention to this anymore unless it's very interfering. It isn't the most important thing about language, is the form. If I've got kids where it's so interfering that we do have to do something about it, and it's usually part and parcel of a bigger language problem. It doesn't usually exist by itself. If this is all they're doing, if they're just using word tenses incorrectly, or they're not putting ing endings on word, well, you know, let's check back with you in a year and see how you're doing, because this could still develop. So it's sometimes part and parcel of it, well, it's often part and parcel of a bigger language picture, in which case I would definitely address it, because the chances are it's not going to necessarily develop on its own. But if that's all there is, it's usually not a big deal. Social language, we also call this pragmatics. It's how they're pulling that all together to communicate with people appropriately. It's their interaction. It's all that piece about why do we use language? How do we communicate with people? How efficient are we at reading all the social clues and pulling it all together and responding in the nanosecond of time that typical brains do that in. So it's getting bigger and bigger. With the rise in autism in particular, this piece of the job is really getting big. It's kind of knowing when to ask the question, knowing when to show interest, knowing who to pay attention to when you're, say, talking to two or three different people. Who do you look at when you're talking? For a lot of these guys, it's knowing when to stop talking, knowing when to give up your talking turn, knowing that other people get a talking turn, that you don't just keep on talking, knowing that listening doesn't just mean looking at the teacher, that you also have to keep your mouth shut and stop talking. I mean, these kids, some of the difficulties they have is kind of mind-blowing because they don't get that stuff. And it is neurological, you know, they can't really help it. They really need to be consciously taught this stuff. So this is where I should have started, with typical language development. In your handout, I have broken down school-age language development. You guys have a textbook that's got the kind of birth to 6 language development. There's a lot of information out there on the birth to 6 language development. But the thing about language is it really never, ever, ever stops developing. Right now, I'm still developing language at 52 years old. We are always all constantly developing language. It never stops. We're building our vocabularies. We're expanding our knowledge all the time of how words are related. Oh, you can use that word that way? Oh, cool. We're always building. So language is a very fluid and dynamic thing. And we have to think in terms of some of these kids, the developmental pathways. It's important to kind of get a sense of development, typical development of language. You would not expect a grade 2 student to be able to follow instructions and understand language and use language in the way that you would expect a grade 8 student to use it. And that's a really important difference, and it's because they are still really, they're at a very early concrete level of language still at age 7. By the time they get to age 13, they are starting to develop some abstraction as their brains grow. So it's really important to kind of get that typical language development sequence. I'll sometimes get people talking to me about a kindergarten student who's not following these 3-step directions. Like, well, you know, they're kindergarten, let's give them some time because 3-step directions come later. So it is a matter of knowing what's typical for that age. Now, when you're out there and you're teaching groups of kids, you start internalizing that sense because you get a sense of what the masses are at. But it is an important thing to remember when you're looking at individual kids. There's a difference between delay, the other thing is about typical language learners. We are innately programmed to learn language. So we have to be exposed to it in order to learn it. But our brains, they're sitting there waiting to be exposed to it. As soon as they're exposed to it, they start learning it. Typically, that's what happens. We just learn language. We don't need to be taught it. We learn it through interaction with our parents, with our siblings, with whoever else is around us. We just learn it. It just happens. When kids have a problem with language, there is something neurologically based. Now, there are cases where the environment is so damaged that it does impact their language development, amongst many, many other things. But you would really have to have a kid have zero interaction to have the environment impact them to that degree, that their language is just not going to develop because of it. Kids just learn language. If their brains are wired to learn language, they're going to just learn it. When we run into problems is really about neurology. Some of their brains are going to be slower to develop language. They're developing it at the same way. They're following a typical language development pattern, but they're just doing it a lot slower. It's just taking them longer to work through those stages. I have a little girl right now, and I can really see that it's all about a delay because she's getting some of the stuff that the guy with the disorder is not getting, because she is developmentally tracking through all those steps just as she should be, but she would do great with not graduating until she's 20, because it's going to take her that much longer to just get her brain in motion and gather up all the concepts that she needs in order to progress through her language and through the school system. A disordered kids, their development is going to be very different. They're going to have some skills that are going to be following the normal developmental sequence. They're going to be having some skills that are just so skewed and off there that it doesn't make any sense. So you can get a kid who can tell you in great detail about his trip to Disneyland. He'll tell you every tiny little detail about it, but he can't answer a who question. So if he tells you all about his Disneyland trip and you say, well, who about it? There's a language disordered kid, because the who question should come developmentally before the ability to tell this great long sequence of events.
I was just wondering if a child has like really great language skill, even above average in the vocabulary and everything, but has a written writing output, written and reading, is that a disorder still? Like
It really, yeah. That's a really good question, because this is where you really need good observation, you need good evaluation, because some of those kids, even though on the surface it sounds like they have good language, they're using this very sophisticated vocabulary. When you start probing that a little bit, you find out that actually there is more going on there than it appears. Some of those kids who are, whose vocabulary is kind of limited in terms of connections, they really have a very rigid use of that vocabulary. We had a guy who kept saying that those kids are acting very mature when they were acting up. They're acting very mature. And he sounds good. He uses this very high level of vocabulary, sounds great on paper, assesses really strongly. But those kids are acting very mature. I don't like it when they act mature. His interpretation of mature was from the video games that are rated mature, which means they're... yeah, you get it, right? So does he have a sense of what mature means? Yes, he does. Is he going to use it incorrectly in his writing? Absolutely he is. So it kind of depends on the type of language, the type of writing problem it is, the way it manifests. Learning disabilities, they used to say 80% of learning disabilities were language-based. I think that's probably still about true. Most of the kids that I get referred to me in kindergarten and grade 1 for language-based issues end up with some sort of learning challenge, if not a full learning disability. And it's because when the language is delayed or disordered, it's going to impact it. So the disorder is when it's not following that developmental sequence, it's developing in a non-typical way. So in the classroom, can you make a guess what these guys would look like? Kids with a language processing disorder? Yeah.
Severe behavior because they're struggling.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. You're going to get behaviors from them. Yep.
Probably a lot of frustration and stuff we see, and maybe lashing out, something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, for sure. You are going to get a lot of behaviors with these guys. Frustration. A lot of times they think they get it and they don't. And this is those kids that are often working just fine but on the wrong thing. They're going to have problems following directions, right? Of course they are. They're not going to be able to follow the directions that a typical kid. And again, thinking in terms of developmentally where this age group is at, whatever the age group, you want them to be following directions at that age level. If they are not following directions at the age level they should be, they're going to have problems with that. Often they'll take a long time to respond. Or, the other thing that happens, they have a sense that they're slow to respond and they're not really getting it, so they'll respond really quickly and carry on and hope that you didn't notice they were wrong, or they don't recognize that they're wrong. They think they get it, so they're ready to move on. I had this little guy that I worked with for years, and he has, I think, a major auditory processing disorder, and he has language processing disorder up the yin-yang and a very severe learning disability. And he was always one who would respond right away, but he was always wrong. And when you tried to take him back to show him that, he had no patience for it. He didn't want to go on there. The other kids were responding fast, so he was going to respond fast. And he was very, very concerned about how the other kids perceived him, and he still is. He's in grade 8 now. He still is very concerned about the perception of other kids, to the point where he won't accept help. And he's got a very severe learning disability. But that response time, somehow, if they're not recognizing their need for the response time, they can look impulsive, but we have to get them to understand their need for that response time, because it does look like impulse. When the kids do take a long time to respond, it can look like attitude, it can look like refusal, it can look like disinterest, it can look like a lot of those negative things, it can look like fear, it can look like anxiety. And sometimes they're not necessarily anxious or fearful, they're just thinking. The words are just taking time. And their brain just works at a slower pace. They'll forget things they hear. So you will say, pull out your books. And they'll say, what did you say? They just won't be able to retain that. You will find these guys more attentive to the visuals. Some of the more skilled kids will be looking for the visuals. The ones who have recognized that that's a strategy will start searching for them. Not all of them have that strategy. Some of them, especially the ones who act out more, they don't have any strategies to deal with their lack of comprehension. So they're just kind of acting out and they're not looking for the visuals. This is something that we want to teach them, is to learn how to find the visuals and to understand that those visuals are there to help them and that they will help them. Their academics will be full of gaps. Depending on the nature of their language problem, you will see gaps in different areas in their learning. I have a little guy who has a very, very long processing time. He's thinking really hard about it. He has incredible insights. While he's busy processing and thinking deeply about this item number 1, the class has moved on 5 steps to item number 5, and he has missed all that stuff in between. Even though he actually is a pretty good reader, and he enjoys writing, but he's missing stuff. He is missing huge gaps in the lessons because he's so busy processing the first part and developing this deep understanding of it. And some kids are like that, right? They can't understand it unless they have a deep understanding. They need to really think it through and get all aspects of it before they are going to truly understand it. And this guy's like that, but he is missing large chunks of academics. Now he's in grade 3. When he hits the faster pace, the curriculum speeds up starting in grade 4 and gets progressively faster, progressively more abstract. He's going to really struggle. He's a reason why I think that move towards inquiry-based learning is really exciting, because he's that kind of guy. He'll really benefit from that. These guys, because of their lack of ability to attend to the auditory information, they're very routine bound. They like their routines. They could have trouble with transitions. They might have trouble learning new routines, because especially if we're doing it all auditorily, they're really going to struggle with that. This is how they make sense of their world. They will often have difficulty understanding what they read. Some kids are better at decoding than reading. A lot of them have difficulty with decoding as well. And again, when I talked earlier about that difference between what grade level you're at, we can't measure their comprehension of the spoken language appropriate for their age compared to their reading comprehension. There are kids who look like their comprehension of reading is just fine, but their comprehension of language is not. Often their comprehension of reading is really impacted too. I actually had a really interesting guy yesterday. He decodes like crazy. He can read anything you put in front of him. His comprehension, his student support services teacher was really feeling that his comprehension was affected. So she did this, it's called the GORD, and I can't remember what that stands for. It's a reading assessment. It's a multiple choice reading assessment. He actually scored just fine on this for making inferences. It's multiple choice. Why could he score just fine on this?
It's not asking for recall, it's recognition.
Exactly. He's given choices to choose from. And he's a bright guy. He's smart enough to be able to say, oh, let's think about this choice, let's think about this one. But you ask him to draw those connections on his own, no, he can't do it. So yes, of course his reading comprehension is affected. So we have to really be mindful of what we're calling it. And some people are pretty insistent this guy's reading comprehension is just fine. We're kind of going, well, only if you feed him the right information. His comprehension isn't fine when he's got to do it on his own, right? And then they might have a surface understanding of it, but they might lack that in-depth, more abstract understanding. And that's where your inferential thinking starts really coming into play. Their ability to understand a sequence of events, to understand the problems and start coming up with solutions to the problems. That's more abstract language involved in that. And sometimes they can get the surface stuff, but not as it goes deeper. They might have difficulty with that expressive part. I've seen kids who have no problems with expression, but have lots of problems with comprehension. Those kids are kind of tricky because their expressive language is good. The comprehension issues are often not detected. So I will get kids and I'll say in a school-based team, well, what about their language comprehension? Well, their language is fine. They're really verbal. They talk a lot. They have no problems expressing themselves. But what about their comprehension? Their expressive language can mask comprehension difficulty. So that's a really important thing to understand. But often they do have difficulty expressing their ideas. They can almost sound like they're stuttering sometimes. I've got an example of a kid who really sounded like he was stuttering. And he wasn't a stutterer. It's just that it was so hard for him to pull his words out that he couldn't express himself fluently. You don't have to have auditory processing problems to have difficulty hearing in background noise. People with language processing problems, because they're working so hard to extract the meaning of what they hear, background noise is really going to interfere with their auditory system. And of course, the behavior problems, frustration. They might even, because they're not understanding anything, if I was sitting in a nuclear physics class, I'd be bored out of my skull because I wouldn't understand it. And I think a lot of times it is not just frustration that it's impacting these guys, it is boredom because there's all this stuff happening, they don't get it. So I'll just go into my own little world because there's nothing else to do. I don't have anything to do, I don't get it. So this guy, this was really interesting when I assessed him. So I gave him a picture sequence of a boy getting ready for school and being late. And while he was talking, I recorded him. And I also wrote down what he said. Now, when I wrote down what he said, sounded pretty good. Sounded like he was including a lot of stuff. I thought, oh, you know, he's going to score pretty well on this. And then I listened to the recording, and this is the recording. And it looks nothing like what I heard. And here's that thing. We can, unless we actually sit and evaluate it, we're filling the gaps in for these kids. We're working really hard to pull the information out of them. I once had a kid where it took me about 2 weeks to figure out what he had told me in an assessment. And it was like an aha thing, but that's way too much work. It should not take a listener 2 weeks to figure out what the message was. It shouldn't take the listener 2 minutes to figure out what the message is. So I was filling in all these gaps when I was writing it down. And you look at this language, and this language is not good language. This language, he really does sound like a stutterer here with all of his ums and repetitions. He wasn't fluent, and when I listened to it, I was listening to it objectively and thinking, wow, this isn't good. And when I wrote it down, it really didn't reflect what he was actually doing. So we have to think too, if we have to work hard, if we're filling in the gaps for them, we know what they're meaning. We're kind of getting their meaning. And so we're filling in, oh yeah, I understand. You're saying da-da-da-da-da. We've done all the work for them. And they haven't had to use their language skills to get their message across. Are they communicating effectively, or are we communicating effectively? When you think about it, their communication isn't very effective. Ours is great. But we need them to be the effective communicators, because people aren't going to always fill in those gaps for them. And they're not always going to be able to get their message across clearly enough so people can fill in their gaps. So then this guy was really interesting. So this is a picture of these alien spaceship landing in a park, and a family of aliens coming out, and these two kids, the boy looking horrified and the girl looking eager, like she wants to go run and meet them. I've never had a kid do it all in a dialogue form. I've done this lots, but when you look at this, again, it sounds pretty good, like the sentences are good, you know, it's pretty fluent, it was pretty smooth coming out. But does he tell us anything about it? If he said this, would we really know what he was talking about? We don't have a clue what he's talking about. So this is a language disordered kid. He's not telling us what's going on, he's not telling us where it is. You couldn't reproduce that picture in your head from this description at all. He did a better job on that sequence picture thing, because he did better with the increase in structure, but this was really interesting. He's a real interesting guy, undiagnosed. So, the next part. So, okay, I'm going to break at about 10 for about 15 minutes, and then, and I should have said this before, I'm so disorganized. At noon we'll have a half-hour lunch break. Sound good? Okay, so executive functioning. Have you guys heard of this before? Somewhat? Yeah? Did it come up yesterday in the FAS? A little bit? Okay, this is really important stuff. The executive function is primarily the responsibility of the frontal lobe of the brain. It interacts with the rest of the brain. The frontal lobe interacts with the rest of the brain for these. They're not isolated to the frontal lobe, because nothing in the brain exists by itself, right? Everything interacts and joins together. Now this is where, like, I'm a little vague on brain stuff. I learn it, I forget it, because I don't talk about this every single day with the kids. I don't do this every day. So I had to kind of remind myself about what parts of the brain are affected for these things, because I know it's neurological, I understand it's neurological, I know how to deal with neurological issues, and I move on. But the important thing that I just want you guys to get out of it is these are neurological issues. So these are not kids who are trying hard to piss you off. They don't want to piss you off. They want to please you. All kids want to please you. Even the really, really annoying ones want to please you. So if there's so many of these kids, it's their neurology and it's not their fault. And we really have to think of that in terms of their neurology. So the red part, obviously, is the frontal lobe. You guys probably know that. So the executive functioning, they're constantly thought of as kind of the controller of the brain, the driver's seat, the cockpit, depends on whose analogy that you pull out of that. These are the pieces, the higher level thinking skills. This is what the frontal lobe is primarily responsible for. And these are things that are really, really, really important in school, in learning. This is what they need to have in place for their learning. They need to be able to reason through situations. If a child has some sort of deficit in their executive functioning, reasoning through situation is really hard. So when you're talking to a student about, say, their behavior, and it feels like you can't reason with them, well, you can't, because they don't have the ability to reason. Problem solving, coming up with solutions. I had this little guy, he was actually an FAS guy, and he had been really frustrated in gym because he was on the losing team and he had hit somebody. So I said to him, what could you have done? So, and I'm working through a problem-solving visual with him. What could you have done differently? He said, nothing. So the only solution to this problem was to hit him. That's all. He said, that's all I could do. So when we talked through it, and he finally came up with, because I gave him one thought, and then I tried to get another one out of him, and he said, I could have told the teacher. I could have told the teacher. And he was super excited that he had thought of another solution to that problem. But he honestly, even though when the incident happened, he was pretty escalated, and we know anxiety shuts down your executive functioning, and he couldn't have thought through that anyway. He also had no other plan. They're a really rigid thinker, no other plan. Attention is in the executive function domain. This is why when you read research on ADHD that they talk about the frontal lobe being slower to develop in kids who are diagnosed with ADHD. Personally, I believe that ADHD is more of a symptom than a cause in and of itself, but you know, that's just my opinion. And I have personal reasons for that. But I think when we have attention problems, it does not often exist in isolation. I think for a very long time, we've written kids off as ADHD, which makes it sound like they can control it if they only tried or were on drugs. And it's just to me, it's a very weak explanation, and there's a lot more going on, and we really have to honor these kids by giving them a full understanding of what's truly going on in their brains. These guys are going to have difficulty with planning. So if you say an assignment is due next week, to a grade 9 student with executive functioning, they are not going to be able to put that together. Their mom is going to say, isn't that assignment due tomorrow? And they're going to be up till 3 in the morning working on it maybe, if they have the executive functioning to pull that off. Predicting, making predictions. This affects everything from word prediction when they're reading, to predicting solutions to problems, the best solution to a problem, to predicting the outcome of a social situation. Any kind of prediction is involved with executive function. Working memory. Do you guys know what I mean by working memory as opposed to just memory? Holding on to information and doing something with it? Yeah. That happens in the frontal lobe of the brain, and with these guys, they often can't. They'll hear the instructions, they'll see the instructions, and they go to do it, and they can't remember what to do. Organization. That's a big one with these guys. The locker is jammed full of stuff, all hodgepodge, absolutely no order or system to it whatsoever. I had this guy who had his locker like that. I did these checklists. This guy came to me mostly because they were wondering about his executive functioning. So I looked at his abstract language and I did some checklists on executive functioning with him, his teacher, and his dad, his parents. And his parents and his teacher put organization as being a huge issue. He said organization wasn't an issue at all. And I said, how come organization is not an issue for you? He said, well, at home, my dad organizes me. At school, Margaret organizes me. What's the problem with that? That's a big problem. He thinks organization is fine, but he's not doing it himself, and he has no system or understanding of it. He's not doing it independently. So yeah, organization is a pretty big problem. Cognitive shifting. This is being able to adapt to anything new and unexpected. So what would I do if 5 more people walked in the room? Could I adapt to that new scenario? Did they get a change in routine? Can they adapt to the change in routine? This is that ability to bring in new information And it's kind of that go with the flow thing. Can they do it? These guys can't do that. Task initiation, getting started. This is a common problem with these guys. They don't know how to begin, and they will sit there and sit there and sit there, and they won't begin. And the one I don't have on here, time management. These guys, that's a huge one, and I should have written it on there. I don't know why I didn't. Time management is really, really important. This is those guys who you say to them, okay, you've got 15 minutes left to finish that assignment, and they haven't started on it in the half an hour. And that 15 minutes is meaningless to them. They still don't get started on it because, yeah, that's nice. You know, I don't know what that feels like. But to these guys, 2 minutes, half an hour, no difference. They don't get it. They've got no internal sense of the passing of time. So giving them time frames, verbally especially, does not affect them. It doesn't give them any more information. They don't know what that means. They don't know what that's supposed to feel like. Does that mean that, I'm supposed to get started? Like, I don't know. I haven't got started so far. I don't know what difference it makes you telling me there's 15 minutes left. Oh, class is over, off we go. They don't have that sense of time. That also comes in with connecting the amount of time to tasks. You do a homework assignment, and even like if we say that this assignment's due in a week, and we've told them the introduction should take you, half an hour to put together. The body of it should take you an hour to put together. We give them those time frames. These guys don't have any sense of what that looks like or feels like. They don't know how to judge what's important to focus on as well. So these are the kids. One of these guys I was working with, he was starting at the top of the test and going through every question. If he got stuck on it, he was done. Because he knew, he'd been told, go through and do all the ones you can do, right? That's the strategy. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. He was stuck. And he couldn't figure out what the important ones were to do. So if one is worth 20 points, go and do that one first before you do the ones worth 5 points. But they don't have that sense of that organization piece, that planning, that prioritizing, that impacts all of that kind of ability. So they're going to have trouble with all of that, anything that requires any of those skills, which is schoolwork, right?
So, as a teacher, how do you deal with that?
How do you deal with that? I have quite a few strategies to deal with it. I use analog clocks. I think the digital clocks are a complete waste of our time, and they should never, ever exist. When they first came out, I was kind of excited about digital clocks, because I thought, even the kids who can't tell time can read the time. But what does that create? They don't learn that passage of time. They don't learn what half an hour feels like. Even some kids who have executive functioning aren't learning that passage of time, because analog clocks do teach that sweep of time. They teach what it feels like. I like a lot of focus on an analog clock. The one guy who couldn't start, and I think we have to be careful how we frame that in our language between wouldn't and couldn't. This guy couldn't get started on his work. So what we did is we shortened up the work. Somebody gave that as a strategy. Absolutely, that's a really good strategy. So he only saw a little bit at a time. The other thing, his dad downloaded an analog clock app onto his phone. And the teacher said, when they were starting a test, she went over and she said, okay, when the big hand is right on this 5, that's when you should have these 3 questions done. He was finished in 2 minutes. He got started and he was done. So then she went over and she said, okay, now when the big hand is here, you should have these 3 questions done. Again, he was finished really fast. This is a kid who never started. All year he never started. All of a sudden he's ripping through it. It's doable, it's understandable, he can see, it's very little to do compared to this whole page of stuff, and he can connect it to the time passing because he's got a visual frame of reference to track it with. He could track that big hand moving down there. Really important. I was going to say something else about that and I forgot, but that's okay. So, executive function, it's important in terms of mediating our emotions, understanding our body signals. It's important for self-regulation because we have to be able to read ourselves and to know what we have to do. You need to not only read yourself to self-regulate, but you need to be able to plan what you're going to do about the different states that you're in. And that requires executive functioning. Predicting outcomes, really important for problem solving. You have to have that mental flexibility to think of different ways of solving a problem and then choose the one that will work the best. And you have to do that based on planning, on sequencing, on prioritizing, on reflecting on past experiences. All of that is executive functioning. Novel solutions to problems, initiating appropriate actions and responses. That goes along with your inhibition of impulses. You have to know how to evaluate a situation and know what the best and most appropriate response to it is. I think sometimes, I don't know, I do this, maybe nobody else does this. You're in a situation and you think of all the crazy inappropriate things you could do, but of course you would never do those, unless you're autistic. Because it would not, you're really concerned about what people think of you all the time, right? So you're not going to do those. But it doesn't mean that those thoughts don't go through your head, or at least they go through mine. Then there's that self-monitoring piece too. You're going to, and I mean, we all do this. When I'm in a situation, a social situation, any kind of situation, I'm constantly judging myself. How am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing? We do that. And then, when you go away from it, you think, oh, geez, I think when I said that, I hurt their feelings. I've got to go back and fix that. So you're checking in with yourself. You're seeing how you impacted other people. I hurt that person's feelings. Now I've got a plan to do something about it. And if I say these words, you might rehearse the words to yourself. Am I doing? People do that, right? Like, that's not just me, is it? Right? You rehearse, you think about it. Do I obsess too much on that? I don't know. But in that next situation, I would be really careful how I approach that person.
So if we're not seeing these kinds of things happening in a classroom, those are the indications of executive functioning difficulties?
Yeah, yep, for sure. You would definitely see difficulties with this. Impulsivity is a big one. Attention problems. I've got a list coming up of all of those. And another big one that is kind of a different way of thinking too, it was kind of an aha thing for me, was that thinking that using that past experience to monitor and evaluate what's going on now, to form your actions now, to plan for your actions. When you think about it, it's our past experience with this person that might change what we're doing with this person. It might be our past situation with this, our past experience with this situation that affects how we're dealing with it right now. But we really use our past experiences to change what we're doing in the situation we're in or with the people we're in.
Would sense of consequence be affected then?
Pardon me?
Sense of consequence.
Sense of consequence?
Like, would that be affected if they're not, like, I just mean if they're not able to link past experience to, oh, if this happens, this is what's going to happen to me then?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And with students, as you would have heard yesterday, students with fetal alcohol syndrome do have a lot of problems with that whole learning from consequences, and that is exactly that. Learning from your past experiences and applying them to different situations as they come up. That's what learning from consequences is all about, right? And executive functioning, FAS kids do have executive functioning problems, so you will see that. Now, I had a checklist that I got out of this Chris Kaufman book, and it's wonderful. I use it all the time, and I forgot these books. So all you get is the title. I meant to bring them, to show them to you, and I even meant to give you, maybe I shouldn't do that, copyright things, give you copies of the checklist. But anyway, the Chris Kaufman book has a great set of checklists in there. This is the one I was doing with that student. There's one for the student, one for the teacher, and one for the parent. Now, I had one teacher fill it out, and she really struggled with it, and I think I should have sat down with her and gone through it with her. They're better done as a team, and you can have a discussion about it, but the information that comes out of it is actually really, really good. It gets you thinking about each of those areas of executive functioning. There's a section on time management, there's a section on cognitive shifting, there's a section on, I can't remember all the sections, but all the questions relate to each of the areas.
Can you say the name of the author on the left?
This one is Christopher Kaufman, Kaufman, and I'm sorry that is not in your handout, but he's really good. There's quite a few strategies in these books. What I find with the strategies in the executive function books is they're often more geared towards home than the classroom. There's lots of homework strategies of how to organize a homework space for a child with executive function problems. But my struggle is, we need more strategies for the classroom. Now, there are all kinds of strategies out there, but the books I find don't necessarily have them. But they are both really good, informative books on executive functioning, and and they do have some strategies that can at least get you started. To assess the executive function, everything I have read would indicate that kind of standardized tests aren't necessarily the most accurate assessment of executive functioning. Observation and checklist style of things is far more accurate and more, more real, gives us more information, helps us pin it down a little better. There are standardized tests that help with that. There's some that help distinguish whether it's attention or something else going on, or cognitive shifting. The cognitive shifting, there's a specific test that they're told they have to figure out the rule for the cards going down. I can't remember the name of it, the Wisconsin something or another, where they're told there's a rule for the cards that go down, and then they learn the rule and they start responding, and then you switch the rule on them. Can they adapt to that? I can't remember the name of it, but it's kind of that, can they adapt to the new rule? Because they're going to start using the old rule, can they then switch their thinking to it? Some of the tests that I do as a speech pathologist actually clue me into some executive functioning stuff, because when we do assessments, we look at the concrete language, we look at the abstract language, and the problem solving and so forth.
If you did a brain scan of kids like with executive functioning problems, would it look differently than like a typical brain?
You know, I would guess so.
Yeah.
That, the whole looking specifically at the brain is still blossoming. My guess is yes. Some kids absolutely, like the autism brain looks very different, the FAS brain looks very different. I think the more and more they use the brain scans and that information for diagnoses, which is really what we should be doing rather than just looking at behavior, the more they use it, I think we will get more and more information on some of those subtle differences in the brain, because I'm sure for some kids with executive functioning problems it looks really different than other kids. One of the things about executive function, in order to be a good executive functioner, in order for your executive functions to work, you need to have adequate sleep, you need to have proper nutrition, and you need to be in a state of alertness, of calm, alert, and ready to learn. If you are not, you cannot engage your executive function. How many kids come to school with lack of sleep and lack of nutrition? We have a lot of kids who walk in the door where even if they have a brain that's properly wired to have good executive function, they are not able to engage that executive functioning because they didn't get enough sleep, they didn't get enough food, or their parents had a big fight in the morning, or they tripped over the dog on the way out the door, or they're a really highly anxious kid and walking in the building increases their anxiety. Anxiety totally hijacks executive functioning, and when you think about it, how often do we make as adults unreasonable decisions in the moment of anxiety? When we are stressed, when we are angry, when we are escalated in any way and we're up in this state, is that the time to be making a good decision? Are we going to make any big decisions in that time? Would it be a stupid decision if we made it? Absolutely, and these kids are no different. When they are escalated, they're not going to make good decisions. They can't. To talk to them about their choices in this moment, it's not going to work because they're way too escalated. They can't engage their executive function. We always have to wait till they're ready to engage, till their brains are ready to engage in thinking again. That's why that anxiety curve, you guys seen the anxiety curve? Yes? Yes? That is, it just looks like this. I'm going to come back to it later. So this is calm. This is the peak, and they use it for anger too, but this is when you are in your peak state, when you have zero access to any kind of thinking skills. And then there's also a coming down place at the end too. So they're not accessible for any sort of teaching about that situation until they're back down here. So that's a really important thing to remember, is that coming down piece. I'm going to talk more about it later when I talk about some of the strategies, the 5-point scale. Have you guys heard of the 5-point scale? Yeah? Good. I'm going to talk about it more. So these guys in the classroom, think about some of the things around language processing when I show you some of these things too. Oh, I thought I had this lion thing going on there. You get it all at once. So they are inattentive often, very distractible, or they could look really distractible. I've had kids who are observant of every little detail in the class, but they don't know what's important to focus on. They know everything going on, but they don't know where to put their attention. That's executive functioning. They can have difficulty making notes, summarizing, doing inferential thinking, writing down. I've heard of kids in classes where they've had to take notes, and they don't even start. They don't even get going. And then it becomes a task initiation thing, right? Why are they having problems with task initiation? Because they don't really know how to take notes. They don't know what notes look like. They don't know what they are. They can't think in terms of the most important information because they've got all this information coming at them and they don't know what to zero in and they don't know what's important. So how are you going to start something that you don't know how to do? You're going to see off-topic comments. They blurt out in class because that's that inhibition, that impulse control that they're lacking. Off-topic comments, that's the attention piece that could be going on there. In their impulsive behavior could really interfere with socialization. This little guy who did the checklist with me, he told me when we went through the different things, his priority, his biggest concern that he had about himself was his impulsive behavior. Because he said, sometimes I hit people. And his remorse kicked in. Like he just said the words, and his little body just folded in and his face sank. He was 12, and he felt awful about this losing control things. Now, it happens so seldom that neither his parents nor his teacher thought it was really that important to focus on. He was devastated by the fact that he did it, and in his mind, he did it a lot. But the reality was he didn't do it that much. But because in his mind it was so big, we did decide to do something, to take some action to deal with it. But that's because it was important to him, right? And again, because of the working memory, they forget the instructions as soon as they start with work. They can't make predictions. They are really rigid in their thinking. Unexpected things happen. They can't adapt to any new information or new situations. They don't get started on their work. That's a huge one. They use class time really poorly. These guys, they're not working in class. They're socializing. They're doing everything else, but they're not getting their work done. And again, that time management piece, they're having problems managing and understanding time. So when you say this should only take you 5 minutes, they haven't started in 20 minutes have gone by and they haven't begun. They'll forget all the steps involved in a task, or they might forget the order of the steps. They don't know what comes first. They know they've got to do these 3 things, they're not sure of what to do first. You know, that's that kind of prioritizing, sequencing, organizing of information things and knowing what's important. That is, you know, it's all tied in together, right? They're confused about what they're supposed to be doing when. And obviously, executive functioning looks different in every kid who's got difficulties with it. Some kids have more problems with disorganization, but they can actually get started on their work and they can kind of manage their time okay. But they're just a mess. They're really disorganized. Some kids are ultra organized, but they can't get started on their work. They can't. Their desks are very organized, almost obsessively so, some of them. But they don't know how to start, they can't manage time. So it does look different in every kid. So these are some of the things you might see in them, but just because they don't have all of them doesn't mean they don't have executive functioning problems. Because, you know, different parts of the brain are affected. Every brain looks different. So this is executive functioning things. Okay, of course, my desk looks a little bit like that a lot of the time, so I don't think my executive functioning is necessarily working. The little girl that I was observing last week, her desk had stuff like that around it and on it, and I could see how it happened. She's lying kind of half on her desk as she's working, and her elbow, she had stuff perched on the edge like this, and with some pens on it, and her elbow sliding towards it and sliding towards it. And just at the moment when it was about to tip over, her teacher came over and just automatically, without even thinking, you could see, just straightened it all up. Busy sorted out her space as she's helping her with the work, because that's what we as teachers do, right? We help these kids. I mean, I'm not a teacher, but as you as teachers do that. But their binders are going to look like a disaster zone. This is not that. I see these kind of guys all the time, and usually, if they have a disorganized space, they often have a disorganized brain. And so if learning the strategies to develop their organization skills is going to be a little more tricky for them. I'm just thinking, should we start that? You know what? I didn't show those videos. I'm gonna show you the videos after the break, I think. The video on that. I'll start on the autism stuff now, and then we'll have a break in 10 minutes. And then I'll show you the videos, and then we'll carry on. This is me. I have some executive functioning stuff. I don't necessarily have a reorganized brain. So do you guys have heard a little bit about autism? I've heard comments, you know a little bit about it. Okay. It's a huge, huge, huge topic right now. They just changed the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual so that the diagnosis is different. There used to be several categories under autism that were diagnosed as autism, but they've changed it all now. There is basically, you get diagnosed with autism, level 1, 2, or 3, and there's basically no such thing as Asperger's anymore. They've taken that out of the DSM. And they've put in semantic pragmatic disorder, which has a lot of features of autism without some of the repetitive stereotype behaviors or the, I can't remember. I think that's all they have. I can't remember. I've got the DSM thing. But it is different, so because the diagnosis has changed, some of those kids we feel are kind of spectrum-y type kids aren't going to get the diagnosis because they don't have enough of the features that would get them a full-blown diagnosis. But we feel like they're kind of spectrum-y kids. And we can treat them like they're spectrum-y kids because the strategies are going to work. We don't have to call them spectrum kids, but we can treat them that way because the strategies are going to work, if that's what they look like. So as with all of these things, the important thing to remember is that it is neurological. These kids can't help it. These kids can be so annoying. They can drive you buggy. But the real thing is they can't help it. Like you could come in and start the class at 12:32 and they knew that it was supposed to start at 12:30 and they're going to say, you're late, we were supposed to start at 12:30. It's 12:32, we're 2 minutes late, you're 2 minutes late starting this class. Teachers aren't supposed to be late. And you want to strangle them. It's really frustrating. That's the kind of thing you're going to run across with these guys. But they absolutely can't help it. We have to teach them how to deal with things like the teacher starting class 2 minutes later than she said, right? So yeah, they're annoying. But they can't help it. The deficits are in, and this is where I kind of had to remind myself, I know it's neurological, I keep forgetting what parts of the brain are affected and how it's different, because I don't use that information all the time, so it kind of slides out of my brain. The cerebellum, the limbic system, and the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe means, of course, what are they going to have? Absolutely. They all have executive functioning problems. The cerebellum, I've got it in the next slide. I'll remember that in a minute. We'll go to the next slide and we'll explore that. Social cognition, using language socially, interacting socially. There's a lot involved in that, so I do have a specific slide around social cognition that we'll go over. Autism is not related to level of cognitive ability, and you know what I mean by cognitive ability, right? Like, I don't want to say how smart they are, but that's kind of based on IQ testing, which I totally disagree with IQ testing, but anyway. They can have any cognitive level, so they can be a really super bright, academically bright kid, and I say academically because we tend to think of kids who have strong academics as bright kids, but when they are failing so badly socially and emotionally, their self-regulation and everything else, can we truly call them a bright kid? Like, it seems a little unfair to them to put that expectation on them of saying, but they're such a bright kid, why are they doing this? They can't help it, it's their brain. But of course, then there's the low level, and the way they got the new DSM, level 1, 2, and 3, I think level 3 is the lower functioning guys. You know, the traditional kind of what they used to call Kanner's autism, where the rocking and the head banging, and cognitively they're quite low. So it can be any level. Because of their neurological issues, they have sensory issues, they have language processing weaknesses, and executive functioning, of course. Their repetitive stereotype behaviors, the hand flapping, the rocking, lining up toys, topic perseveration. Do you guys know what perseveration is? Just to make sure. Okay. That's the one, the topic perseveration in the higher functioning guys is the one that drives people buggy because they won't let go of things. We're going to Disneyland next week. We're going to Disneyland. Did I tell you we're going to Disneyland? When we go to Disneyland, I'm going to go on this ride. I'm going to go on this ride. We're going to Disneyland. Of course, something like that would have them so wound up and excited that their thinking brain is completely shut down. And it can be anxiety too. I had a little guy, I'm going to talk a little bit about reward systems later, but I had this little guy who was on a reward system for if he had a good day, he had a happy face put at the top of his page. And one day he didn't have a happy face put at the top of his page, and I happened to be in the class when he was in there. And he just hit the top of that anxiety curve. My parents are going to kill me! My parents are going to kill me! My parents are going to kill me! Totally perseverating on, my parents are going to kill me. Which, you know what, his parents would like not even talk to him about it. It would be like a nothing thing for them. But in his mind, it was huge not to have that happy face there. One day, a teacher who was new to him put a sad face at the top because he'd had a bad day. Not a good idea. Yeah, he spiked out pretty high on that day. But that's, anxiety can cause that perseveration on a topic. Excitement can cause it. An area of special interest, they want to talk about nothing but trains. They want to talk about the Titanic for hours. And they'll just perseverate. We've got one guy who perseverates on Godzilla. To the point where he's not allowed to talk about Godzilla in school anymore, because that was all he could talk about. But those are things that do tend to drive people buggy, thus the forbidden Godzilla. They are very rigidly adhered to their routines, and again, remembering this is neurological, they need a ton of support to understand change and to adapt to any kind of change in their routine and to make those shifts from one activity to another. They get very upset at changes in their routines. Change in general, any kind of change is really hard for them. A TOC in the class can send some kids just flying out the window. We had a kid who, as soon as we knew the teacher was going to be sick, we had a backup plan for him because there was no point in him even trying to be in the class. It was just too hard. Joint attention. Do you guys know what joint attention is? Joint attention is shared attention. It's me saying, oh, you know, look, I got this. I'm showing it to you. We're both putting our attention on it. We're sharing attention to something. It might be me showing you the plane in the sky. It's me drawing your attention to this. This is joint attention. We're sharing our attention onto the anxiety curve. Whatever, that's a shared attention thing. That naturally develops in children. They naturally want to share things with you. So when babies are going, look, that's joint attention. Kids on the autism spectrum do not naturally develop joint attention. You will see they don't do the pointing response, or they do it in a very limited way. They're not trying to engage people in what they're doing. They're not doing that connectedness thing. And as they get older, that takes different forms. That looks a little differently. It's not so much about pointing and showing you their toys. It becomes more complex and abstract things that they're not sharing with you. And even their topics, they're not necessarily sharing things with you. One thing I didn't put on here, but is actually really, really important, perspective taking. We call that theory of mind. But it's taking the perspective of another person. Being able to stand in someone else's shoes and think about how they're thinking. And that impacts them across the board. It is huge. It is one of the most significant social deficits that these kids experience. It's 10 o'clock, so how about we come back at 10:15 and see it?